This episode does have content that some may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. For over a decade, there had been unanswered questions regarding what happened to Alison Day, Marcia Tamboza, and Anne Locke. Missing pieces that the evidence was unable to explain. Yet as John Duffy continued his testimony on the stand during the trial of his accomplice David Mulcahy in 2001, he would disclose details of their crimes, which revealed what happened from the killer's perspective. Join me as I continue the trial of David Mulcahy. Throughout his time on the stand, John Duffy rarely showed any emotion as he gave evidence against his former friend. However, when it came time to discuss what happened on the freezing evening of the 29th of December 1985, his demeanour changed, and at times he seemed to struggle to continue. This may be because of the alleged nightmares he'd been suffering, which featured a young woman being chased along a canal towpath at night. Duffy recalled that on the day of Alison's murder, he had spent most of the day watching films and intended to join his family at an event at a local social club that evening. But instead he was enticed out by Mulcahy, who was eager to go hunting, having been bedridden for the last 3 weeks with bronchial pneumonia, a situation Mulcahy would later use as his alibi for the evening. Mulcahy had spent the day looking after his children while his wife was visiting family in India. Yet, after collecting Duffy, the children were taken to their maternal grandmother's in King's Cross, where they would stay the night, leaving the two men free to trawl the city streets. Having struck out at their usual haunts, the cold weather and festive season likely limiting the number of people out that night, they headed to Hackney Wick, an area which has been transformed due to the 2012 Olympics. But in the 1980s it was a run-down part of London. Dark passageways and open wasteland created the perfect breeding ground for criminal activities, including rapes and muggings. It was a busy industrial area during the day. It wasn't a place many would choose to be when darkness fell. The pair parked their van near the Trowbridge estate and made their way towards the train station, which sat on a prominent position above the various warehouses that surrounded it. It is possible the two men passed by Fairways Graphics, where Alison's fiancé Paul was awaiting her arrival. A window in the factory where he worked offered him a view of the trains coming and going from the station. Arrivals and departures the two men were also interested in. As they mounted the ramp which led to the station, it was just after 7 p.m. when the brightly lit train from Stratford pulled up on the opposite platform, and a solitary figure disembarked, a petite, blonde-haired girl in a sheepskin coat. Spotting her begin to climb the steps of the footbridge, Mulcahy emerged from the shadowy spot they had occupied and ran up the stairs, appearing as though he was hurrying to get to the opposite platform. Yet as he rushed by her, he stopped and grabbed hold of the teenager. Having been joined by his accomplice, the young girl's attempts to scream or struggle were quelled when Duffy placed a knife to her throat. Still holding on to her, Mulcahy offered reassurance that she wasn't going to be harmed as long as she complied. Going against their initial plan of taking the girl into the waiting room, Alison, with the knife-wielding Duffy at her side, and Mulcahy following behind, was forced to walk to the end of the platform and onto the track bed in the direction of the canal. 500 feet along the line, at a point where the railway crossed the canal, they traversed across the track and ascended the steep embankment, with Alison then being dragged beneath the arch of the bridge. In the dark underpass they forced her to remove her clothing, and both men assaulted her. Although Duffy recalls they were briefly interrupted by a man walking along the opposite towpath, an individual who has never been identified. Duffy expressed his belief that had this man glanced over the water, he would have likely caught them in the act. Once the man passed, the attack continued, with Duffy recalling a small detail. He had asked Alison her name and believed she was being truthful due to a gold necklace she was wearing which had the letter A as a pendant. When the two men had finished their assault, Alison was permitted to put her clothes back on. Through terror, she inadvertently put her blouse on inside out. At this point, it seemed her ordeal, like with the previous victims, would soon be over, as she was instructed to head back up the embankment, from where she would climb back down onto the opposite towpath, where she was ordered to stay for 15 minutes, giving the pair time to flee. Yet aside from her clambering back up the embankment to the train line, the rest fell by the wayside. Duffy claimed Mulcahy decided to prolong her torture. Instead of allowing the teenager to walk back across the railway bridge via the track bed, he forced her to use the narrow and ice-covered outer ledge. Precariously perched above the dark water below, Alison pressed her back against the cold iron sheeting. Unable to reach the upper part of the bridge with her hands, she had to balance on the narrow beam that jutted out beneath her feet. It was a difficult task, made impossible by the ice that had formed that cold December evening. And as her pink and white brogues, with soles poorly suited for such an endeavour, fell upon an icy patch, Alison lost her balance, tumbling into the murky depths of the canal. In an attempt to corroborate whether this incident could have occurred, a female police officer braved the ledge herself in 1999, and she proved it was possible to make it across the precarious perch. However, she did not have to contend with the frozen and terrifying conditions confronting the 19-year-old Alison that night. Unlike the officer, Alison fell from the ledge, landing in the middle of the freezing waterway. She resurfaced, and as she flailed desperately to reach the land, the teenager spluttered that she couldn't swim. Duffy claimed he raced down to the embankment and helped her out of the water, and as he and the victim caught their breath on the towpath, it seemed Alison had seen her chance to escape. Despite her sodden clothes and wet jeans clinging to her skin, she fled along the dark path. As she ran from him, Duffy claimed he contemplated letting her go and considered heading in the opposite direction. But once again, Mulcahy, who was on the opposite bank, had other ideas, as he called out to Duffy to go after Alison, clearly enraged by her actions. It didn't take long for the pair to recapture the 19-year-old, but in the ensuing struggle, Mulcahy inadvertently said Duffy's name. This only angered Mulcahy further. He viciously dragged the teenager to a nearby rubble pile, which is likely where the traces of stone came from, which were found on her sheepskin coat. Once there, he attempted to remove her jeans, but still drenched, they clung tightly to her skin. Mulcahy refused to be deterred, his anger building as he forcefully removed the garments and assaulted Alison again. Duffy claimed that throughout this, and the subsequent march across a nearby playing field, he hung back, acting as a lookout, while his friend continued to prolong Alison's terror. Duffy paused in his testimony to the court, and the judge granted him a moment to regain his composure, before he proceeded to recount how Alison pleaded for her life, stating, "Please, it was only the moustache I have seen. I will not tell anyone. Do not hurt me." At the far side of the field, Alison's blouse was cut into strips, one used to gag her, one used to bind her hands, while the third was pulled tightly around the young girl's neck, with Mulcahy grabbing a nearby stick to create a tourniquet. Having tightened the fabric, Mulcahy summoned Duffy over and ordered him to also take a turn of the stick, reminding him that they were in it together. Duffy admitted he complied, but only made half a turn of the ligature before he had to walk away, leaving Mulcahy to finish the job. Alison's lifeless body was then carried back across the field, the pockets of her coat filled with bricks, and she was rolled into the canal, where she would remain undiscovered for the next 3 weeks. The attack had taken around an hour, and as her body disappeared into the murky waters, the two men headed in opposite directions, reuniting at the van on the Trowbridge estate. For 15 years it had been assumed that Alison had left the train station. Many assumed she had been the one who called a taxi company from a nearby telephone box. It was also suspected that Alison had been the young woman observed being grabbed by the arms by two men close to a bus stop. And while these two men had come from the direction of the Trowbridge estate when Mulcahy and Duffy had parked the van, any suggestion that these individuals were them, and this had been a failed attempt prior to Alison's attack, are not supported by Duffy's recollections of that night. Duffy's account confirmed that these sightings were not of Alison. She had been taken from the empty station platform and along the desolate railway track, away from any potential witnesses. Her final moments only truly known by the two men who had ended her life. In the aftermath of the murder, Mulcahy explained to Duffy while driving home that it was necessary, because if she had identified them, they could have been charged with attempted murder. He proceeded to instruct Duffy that he needed to come up with an alibi. Mulcahy stated his was going to be that he was taking care of his children. Duffy, however, had to race home, get changed out of the black clothing he had been wearing, and head to the social club, hoping that people would recall him being there, but may not remember him turning up late. Perhaps due to the police search for the killer of Alison, there appeared to be a lull in Mulcahy and Duffy's attacks. 4 months later, they would strike again. After spending the morning of Thursday the 17th of April 1986 at work, Mulcahy would initially see Duffy at Westminster Council Depot, where they had gone to collect their wages. While there, Mulcahy disclosed that a couple of days earlier he had found a new location, just a short walk from a railway station, which had the railway line running along one side, while fields and woods stretched out on the opposite side. He jovially recalled that as he was checking out the area he had managed to startle a lady walking on the path. This was likely the 66-year-old who recalled a man jumping out of the bushes and doing what was described as a war dance. Unlike their previous attacks, Mulcahy and Duffy didn't wait until nightfall, as they met a couple of hours after collecting their wages and headed off on Mulcahy's bike towards Epsom. They initially rode around, but when they found no suitable target, they parked the motorbike at the train station and boarded a service which took them 20 minutes southeast to Horsley. Departing the little village station, they traversed the approach road and crossed Oakham Road North, where a row of shops stood on their left-hand side, including a sweet shop. The pair proceeded along Kingston Avenue, which followed the railway line, passing by the medical centre and a village hall on the left-hand side, where the road ceased and a footpath began. This led to West Horsley, where 15-year-old Martia Tambozo resided. The teenager had already set off on her journey to buy sweets to take on her school trip to Holland the following morning, and Duffy recalled that they had observed the blonde-haired girl dressed in blue, riding her metallic brown bike, heading towards them on the path. But being on a part of the path not shielded from view, they stepped aside and allowed the girl to pass, with Mulcahy remarking that what goes up must come down. He deduced that the teenager was probably heading to the row of shops they had passed on Oakham Road. As such, she would likely be using the path to return after running her errand. All they had to do was find a suitable spot and wait. The two men continued along the track and reached a point where the path diverged, either continuing towards West Horsley or leading over a footbridge onto Lolliesworth Lane. This slight intersection formed a bend in the path and was surrounded by trees. It was just 500 yards from where the path meets the street, the main thoroughfare through Martia's home village of West Horsley. In the eyes of the two men, it was the perfect place to lay a trap. Mulcahy took a nylon cord from his pocket and set about tethering it to the fence on either side of the track. The pair then took their positions on each side of the route, concealed from view, waiting for the girl in blue to reappear. 10 minutes later, the crunch of tires and the whir of a bicycle chain grew closer. Then the soft squeal of the brakes as the vehicle came to a halt. The cord had stopped the girl in her tracks, and before she could dismount, Mulcahy had pulled her from the saddle. He cautioned the teenager to stay quiet, then passed Martia off to his companion. The pair had come to an agreement that because Mulcahy had dealt with Alison, the next victim would be Duffy's. As such, he led the terrified teenager by the scruff of the neck across the rain-soaked fields, while Mulcahy held back, wheeling the bike beside him. Reaching the opposite side of the field where a copse of trees towered above them, Mulcahy threw the bike into their midst, eliciting a scream from Martia, but she was soon silenced by a backhanded slap issued by Mulcahy, who angrily chastised the trembling child, demanding she stay quiet and didn't look at him. Passing along the perimeter of the trees, the pair took Martia into the neighbouring field, and once again stuck to the edge rather than tracking across the sodden grass. This was possibly to avoid being seen out in the open field with the teenager. With a decent distance between them and the path, Mulcahy decided that the next group of trees was ideal for their needs. But as Duffy tried to lead her beneath the boughs, Martia tried to fight back, but her desperate struggle was brought to an abrupt halt by Mulcahy, who threatened he would hurt her if she didn't comply. Silenced by the threat, Duffy led the girl into the woods, while Mulcahy stood watch nearby. Just 400 yards away, a man had come across the cord still blocking the path. He untied it and continued his journey, unaware of the plight of the young girl being accosted in the woods nearby. Once Duffy had ceased his assault on Martia, he took her by the arm, but was concerned when he could not see Mulcahy. Returning to the site in 1999, detectives discovered the reason for this, as the field in which his companion had been stood had a dip in the middle, meaning someone there would not be visible from the trees. However, it is possible that Mulcahy had been the man witnessed loitering in the middle of the field, as relayed to police later, and it seemed he had also been observed by a woman walking her dog. He would tell his accomplice about this encounter once Duffy and Martia had joined him on the opposite side of the field from the woods. He explained that he had gone to conceal the bike when the woman had spotted him. Having already been assaulted by Duffy, Martia was led into another copse of trees, possibly for Mulcahy to have his turn, as they termed it. But the young girl once again protested, which was met with an aggressive response from Mulcahy, who again insisted she stopped looking at him and reminded her of his warning that if she made a sound, he would hurt her. Duffy detailed how volatile Mulcahy was in that moment, recalling that his companion had been shouting at the teenager as she was escorted across the field. Duffy alleged that without warning, Mulcahy, quote, raised his fist and hit her. She crumpled to the floor. She was struck on the head at the side. It was a swinging blow. I noticed he had a rock in his hand, or a stone. She just crumpled up and fell to the floor. I believe she was unconscious. As the girl lay on the ground near a brilliance of bluebells, Mulcahy removed the unconscious girl's belt and pulled it tight around her neck. Then he placed a stick in the strap, but this time he turned to Duffy and reminded him they were in it together. Duffy claimed he was goaded into turning the tourniquet by Mulcahy, who became increasingly excited with each twist. But then his companion declared that he was going to find the woman who had seen him, and he would leave his accomplice alone to finish the task. However, Duffy later learned that Mulcahy hadn't actually gone far, having stood behind a tree. His friend had watched as he ended Martia's life. After killing the teenager, Duffy stuck to their usual routine. They would go in different directions and meet up later. But as he headed back along the route they had taken, Mulcahy rejoined him, patted him on the back and congratulated Duffy. The elated companion then handed his ginger-haired friend £10, part of the money stolen from Martia's purse, and told him to go to the train station. Duffy claimed Mulcahy returned to the crime scene and attempted to eradicate any incriminating evidence. He wiped down the belt and rock, used tissues to wipe down the body, and lit fires in an attempt to burn the body and the tissues. What is curious is that multiple sources state Martia's belt had snapped, and her scarf had been found around her neck. As Duffy didn't mention this detail, it implies Mulcahy may have caused the belt to snap after his accomplice had departed. Was it possible the teenager was still alive when Mulcahy returned to the body? But to ensure Duffy believed he was responsible for her death, Mulcahy simply didn't mention it. Although he seemed to have taken care to remove incriminating evidence, it appeared Mulcahy may not have been as thorough during his escape from the scene. Multiple witnesses recall a 5'9" man in dark blue, mud-splattered clothing making his way towards the train station and causing the departing train to come to a halt. These were the primary inconsistencies pertaining to Duffy's involvement in the murder, as it seemed very few people actually saw him that afternoon, as he quietly boarded the 6:07 train and was seated just a couple of carriages away from Mulcahy. Departing the train at Epsom, the pair reunited at the motorbike and headed back to London. Duffy's later alibi to police was that he had been at a local video store that day and provided the name of the store and the false name his membership was under. This was probably the details that had added to detectives' belief that he was faking his amnesia. A few days after the murder, two men would meet up, with Mulcahy expressing his elation of taking a life as being a godlike feeling. It seemed to those looking at this case that while Duffy was satisfied with committing rape, Mulcahy was now only deriving pleasure from the act of murder, particularly as it seemed that he did not sexually assault Martia. Another notable detail was that Mulcahy appeared to be the driving force behind the attacks. Like with Martia's murder, their next assault saw him going out in search of a new location, yet this time he had also identified a potential target. A woman who he had watched over the last few weeks getting off the train in the rural village of Brookmans Park. Each Sunday he had seen her at roughly the same time, carrying her white handbag. Having established her routine and noting the quiet, isolated nature of the station, he had determined that would be where they would strike next, noting that there was a path ideally situated beside the station along which they could take their victim to an even more desolate location. On May 18, 1986, he was ready to put their plan into place. And at 6 p.m, he and Duffy, in their usual dark clothing, set off to carry out their attack. Parking his red Alfa Sud by a small parade of shops just a couple of minutes' walk from the station, the two men made their way to wait for the woman with the white handbag to arrive. With time to spare, they explored the path that ran adjacent to the railway line. While there, they paused to allow a man to pass. They exchanged pleasantries before continuing their quest for the ideal spot to bring their victim. By 9 p.m, the lights of the station were illuminated, and the man in the ticket office had headed home for the night, leaving the nearby bike shed unlocked due to a single bicycle still being inside. Duffy and Mulcahy had also noted this bike and recognised it as one designed for a woman, leading them to assume it possibly belonged to the girl with the white handbag. Believing she would return to the shed to retrieve the vehicle, They opted to take the bike and rest it against a fence roughly 60 yards away. They used the gable end of the wooden shed to hide behind, and at roughly 20 to 10 they heard someone approaching. Stepping out from between the bike shed and the ticket office, Duffy encountered a 16-year-old boy. Eager to explain his presence, he asked the teenager if he had seen someone with an air rifle, because a number of people had been shot at. The boy stated he hadn't seen anyone and headed on his way, leaving the two men to await the arrival of the train. Duffy later claimed that they were thwarted in their goal of capturing the woman with the white bag, who had been met at the station by her mother. Despite this, they waited, intent on ensnaring a victim that night, claiming they had considered going home. That was until they caught sight of a potential target. Positioned in the shadow of the bike shed, the two men observed the illuminated windows of the carriages flash by as the 10:01 p.m. train pulled up at the station. As it departed, they observed a solitary figure walking on the platform across the tracks from them. She made her way to the footbridge, which would lead her over the tracks and to the bike shed where they were hiding. Seeing her mounting the steps, Mulcahy dashed to check that the footpath was clear, along which they intended to take her. And as the lone female descended the steps of the footbridge, he returned to Duffy's side. Concealed behind the wooden bike shed, they listened as her gentle footsteps approached, and they waited as she entered the structure to retrieve her bike. With her back turned, the pair pounced, but as Mulcahy grabbed her, Anne Locke screamed, which was heard by a nearby resident at 10:03 p.m. But when this witness looked out the window, she did not see where the sound had come from. Unbeknownst to her, Anne Locke was now in the clutches of the two men, who had ordered her at knife point to stay quiet. Claiming they only wanted her money, they walked either side of her towards the deserted footpath. It was a route Anne had walked on warm sunlit evenings with the man who had become her husband just 4 weeks earlier. But those happy memories were eroded away as she stumbled along the uneven path, the cloak of night impeding her ability to see what lay ahead. Duffy recalled during the 20-minute trek, Anne had begun to tell them about herself, talking about how she was a newlywed whose husband would be frantic when he learned that she was missing. If this was an attempt to humanize herself to her captors, it had little effect, as they continued to traipse along the track, until it was interrupted by Hawkshead Lane, which they crossed before rejoining the path on the opposite side. Here the route entered a wooded area known as Jubilee Woods, a favoured spot for dog walkers. Yet at roughly 10:30 on that Sunday night, it was a lonely and dark place where two men could carry out their deadly deed. Anne was ordered to climb over a fence which divided the path from the railway line, and once she was on the overgrown embankment, she was forced to undress and lie down. Although forensic evidence could not prove what occurred, Duffy admitted that he had raped Anne, while Mulcahy acted as lookout. As stated, it seemed that Mulcahy had lost interest in sexually assaulting his victims, and it may never be known if he did actually rape her. As once Duffy had concluded his attack, the ginger-haired accomplice was ordered to go and retrieve the car. Duffy claimed he complied, but before leaving he had acquired the contents of Anne's handbag, disposing of the items he deemed worthless, including her address book and diary, which he threw away as he traversed fields that lay on the opposite side of the railway line to the footpath they had taken. Duffy claimed he had no knowledge of what occurred between Mulcahy and Anne following his departure, although he stated Mulcahy later told him that he had tried something new with her. However, when Mulcahy joined him in the car shortly after the attack, he was cryptic regarding what had occurred, replying to Duffy's concerns that the woman would be able to recognise them. Mulcahy allegedly told his friend, "Don't worry, she won't say anything." With the knowledge of how Anne died, this could be read as Mulcahy making a sickening reference to how he killed her by forcing a sock into her mouth. The manner of death bore eerie echoes to an assault carried out by Duffy on his own wife a year earlier, in which he tried to push a handkerchief into her mouth. Was this simply a coincidence, or evidence of the one mind, two bodies described by many who survived their attacks? It may never be known why Mulcahy killed Anne the way he did, nor is it likely we will ever know what truly happened prior to her being suffocated. However, it was clear that, as with Mortier, Mulcahy had taken the time to try and destroy potential evidence. He had piled leaves and branches on Anne's body and attempted to burn the remains, which were found concealed in the undergrowth 10 weeks later. Although there had been little evidence to connect Duffy to the crime in 1988, he implicated himself and Mulcahy through his own confession, with his statements lining up with witness testimony retrieved after the murder. A red Alfa Sud had been seen parked outside the row of shops, which was the vehicle the men had arrived in, and police would later find a picture of this car when searching Mulcahy's home. 2 men in dark clothing were observed by a woman who looked out of her window and observed 2 figures walking past her backyard, near to the train station. Another witness recalled seeing a man in his late 20s, who had an elongated face, distinctive chin, and mousy brown collar-length hair, stood looking onto the road from the footbridge. This matched Mulcahy's appearance in the 1980s. Duffy also confirmed he was the man who spoke to the 16-year-old boy by the bike shed roughly 20 minutes before Anne's train arrived, and he corroborated that Anne did scream, just as a witness recalled had occurred at 3 minutes past 10. These witness sightings, combined with the evidence and Duffy's confession, made the case regarding Anne's murder undeniably stronger than it was in 1988, when the jury had been instructed to deliver a not guilty verdict due to insufficient evidence. With Duffy's implication that Mulcahy was solely responsible for murdering Anne, the question was asked whether he was saying this just to remove the blame from himself. Duffy denied this, stating that he had an idea what Mulcahy would do, but instead of preventing it, he walked away, which he claimed made him equally complicit, adding, "If I could stand trial for it now, I would." To conclude the prosecution's case, Mr. Dennis showed the jury a series of images depicting Duffy and Mulcahy as children, photos of a friendship which developed into a deadly duo. Mulcahy's defense, Mr. Carter Stevenson, sought to suggest that the star witness for the prosecution was being deceitful and vindictive in naming his former friend, a loving family man, as his accomplice. It was rhetoric Mulcahy had already spouted during Duffy's time on the stand. Interrupting proceedings, he had denounced Duffy's words as lies and called upon the convicted killer to tell the truth. Following their opening statement declaring that Mulcahy was simply the victim of lies, the defense introduced into court the transcripts of their client's interviews in November 1986, during which he denied his involvement and claimed he and Duffy were no longer close friends. However, the prosecution objected to the defense's desire to read these statements to the court. Instead, they insisted the tape recordings from the interviews be played. The prosecution were hopeful that Mulcahy's tone and demeanour would give the jury a better insight into the man detectives were dealing with. The prosecution's request was granted, and Mulcahy's cocky manner was echoed around the courtroom. A startling witness called by the defence was Lawrence Locke, the husband of Anne, a man who had been deeply traumatised by the events surrounding his wife's death. So much so that he admitted on the stand he could barely recall what occurred in 1986. He proceeded to state he remembered her funeral, the coffin situated in the same place they had stood to exchange their wedding vows. The service had been carried out by the same priest who had overseen their union. But aside from that and her smiles, his memories of that time were gone. Tearfully he told the court, My father died as a result of those events, and my mother grieved for him, and I had to care for her for 10 years. There is a gap in my memory from before we were married. I don't have any clear memories of the night she disappeared, but I have memories of her smile. I remember that vividly. His brief couple of minutes on the stand served only to reopen the scars he'd struggled to recover from, and as he left the witness box, he received apologies from the opposing counsel, and the judge expressing their deep regret at having called upon him to testify. While Duffy didn't take to the stand in his defense during the 1988 trial, Mulcahy took a different stance. He wanted the world to hear his side. In the witness box, he made no secret of the close friendship he and Duffy once shared, but alleged this fell apart due to Mulcahy getting married and the pair having an altercation in 1977 while in a pub. He went on to deny any involvement in Duffy's crimes. He would suggest that the real accomplice may have been someone who simply resembled him, which explained why some of the witness statements matched his description. Aside from calling Duffy a liar, Mulcahy would insinuate that the police had a vendetta against him. They had wanted to stitch him up since 1986 and had planted the DNA evidence in order to implicate him. At no point during his testimony did Mulcahy show any signs of remorse, as he confidently denounced everything against him as being lies or fabrications. In a unique yet unsettling move, during cross-examination, prosecutor Mark Dennis asked Mulcahy to read aloud the words on the page before him. As he began to say them in a cold, monotone manner, the people in the court began to realize he was reciting the lyrics to Michael Jackson's Thriller. The words, now being spoken by Mulcahy, took on a chilling new dimension, as they echoed the actions of the two men who drove around London after midnight, searching for victims. They were the evil lurking in the dark, the beast that was about to strike. Having captivated the court with this simple yet unnerving display, Mark Dennis brought up the final revelation for the jury to consider. In July 1986, Mulcahy had been brought in for questioning due to his prior criminal association with Duffy, who at the time was being considered the prime suspect in a series of rapes, and potentially the murders of Alison Day and Martia Tamboza. During the course of the interview, Mulcahy was asked a series of questions pertaining to his relationship with Duffy and his possible involvement in the rapes and murders, during which he stated he hadn't committed the 3 murders. Furthermore, Mulcahy mentioned Anne's name, even though at this point no questions pertaining her case had been asked. More damning was the fact that the police hadn't formally connected the 3 murders, and Anne's body was only found the day after Mulcahy's interview. Had this simply been a situation where Mulcahy had seen the newspaper reports proposing a link between the 2 murders and Anne's disappearance? Or was it, as Mr. Dennis suggested, Mulcahy knew Anne's name and that she was deceased because he had been the one who killed her? Having sat through one of the longest trials in British legal history, spanning over 5 months, and featuring thousands of exhibits and witnesses, the jury was sent out to deliberate, a task which took them 4 days to complete. Returning to the courtroom on Friday the 2nd of February 2001, each count against Mulcahy was read aloud, finding him guilty on 7 counts of rape, 5 counts of conspiracy to rape, and 3 counts of murder. Sentencing Mulcahy, Judge Michael Hyam addressed the man in the dock and said, "Of the 2 of you, I have no doubt it was you who derived gratification from the act of killing. These were acts of desolating wickedness. You descended to the depths of depravity in carrying them out." While there were tears or cheers of elation from some in the public gallery, one woman sat silently shaking her head in disbelief. Sandra Mulcahy was as certain of her husband's innocence as the day when he was first arrested in 1986. He had assured her he had nothing to do with the crimes Duffy had accused him of, and just like when she learned he was unfaithful, she believed him. It was a stance Sandra would retain during a Daily Mail interview published on the 24th of March 2001, in which she stated, "David has told me he is innocent, and that is enough for me. If in the years to come he admits he did those crimes, then my sons and I will walk away and never see him again. Meanwhile, I believe him 100%. I have often wondered why some people take this stance, even after being confronted with the details of the crimes. And perhaps in Sandra's case it was born out of the power Mulcahy potentially had over her. She was still in her final months of high school when they first met in 1977, and it seems Sandra was quickly charmed by Mulcahy. He took her to the beach and made her laugh. He had been there through the loss of 2 children, one during pregnancy and another who had died from leukemia. He had strove to provide for his family, first through his work with Westminster Council, then as a self-employed decorator. Sandra had forgiven his cheating and his previous crimes. Was this because, as Mulcahy once boasted to work colleagues, she was a completely submissive partner, viewing her as someone he could manipulate and control? At the time of his conviction, Sandra was adamant she would stand by her innocent husband, and whether the passage of time has changed this is uncertain. Mulcahy continued to proclaim his innocence for years after his conviction. He would claim that Duffy had been coached into his confessions and maintained that the police had set him up. His name would be in the press on several occasions. One such story claimed that he had orchestrated fight clubs in prison, which he refuted by a letter to the newspaper. Other reports focused on him being one of over 1,000 inmates who felt that prisoners being unable to vote was unfair. Mulcahy has received compensation when a parcel belonging to him had been damaged. However, his efforts to prove his innocence also remained a topic of discussion. He appealed his sentence and spent many years trying to obtain the documents pertaining to his case, citing his right under the Freedom of Information Act. In 2015, it was revealed he wanted access to thousands of files and documents collated through the various investigations over the last 30 years, many of which contain sensitive information such as the victims' names. The barrister for Scotland Yard, Robin Hopkin, would claim that such a disclosure would result in disproportionate levels of burden in terms of cost and time. At a hearing in March 2015, Mulcahy, via video link from HMP Full Sutton, explained to Judge Margaret Langley that the information he sought was necessary for his appeal, adding, "I am fighting for liberty and life." His pleas proved fruitless, as in August 2015, his claim was dismissed. One of the most reprehensible aspects of Mulcahy's protests of innocence was the creation of a website, which alleged he was not guilty of the crimes he had been convicted of. But the unforgivable part was the publication of the names of many of the rape survivors, women who had suffered a horrific trauma. Many of them had testified in court, with the reassurance that they would remain anonymous, only for their identities to be revealed on such a public platform. While it appears this site no longer exists, Mulcahy has still maintained his stance, particularly when Channel 5 began filming the documentary series The Railway Killers, which was released in 2021. Mulcahy sent a letter to the production in which he stated, "I continue to challenge my conviction for one single fact. I did not commit these horrific crimes." It's a very simple thing to say, but a very hard one for people to believe me. The mainstay of the evidence against me is from a self-proclaimed liar. He was my friend, and I should have seen what he was, a monster. Yours truthfully, David Mulcahy. This is possibly one of the most extraordinary cases in British legal history. It is rare to have a pair of killers, and unlike the other well-known duos, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, or Fred and Rose West, whose bonds were formed through a romantic connection. Duffy and Mulcahy's was formed as childhood friends, united by the bullying they suffered. But their pact that they wouldn't turn on each other was eroded by separation and time, with Duffy becoming one of the only Category A prisoners to testify against a former associate. Yet in all the fascination this case attracts, there are individuals who should never be forgotten. Alison Day, Marcia Tamboza, and Anne Locke. They, alongside the women who survived their attacks, deserve to be remembered. Their stories held up as examples of why it's important to fight to make our streets a safer place to be. Before I go, I would like to recommend the book A Dangerous Place, The Story of the Railway Killers by Simon Farquhar. His father, Charles, was one of the lead investigators on Alison Day's murder. The text, which I believe is one of the most in-depth pieces on the case, not only provides details regarding the investigation, but also provides a detailed and sympathetic insight into the lives of Alison Day, Marcia Tamboza, and Anne Locke. It has proven a great resource for these episodes, and if you want to know more about the case, I highly recommend picking up a copy. Thank you for joining me for It's Murder Up North. More episodes are coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.